Under Suspicion and Police Interviews. The For Legal English podcast is now in session. On today's docket, we discuss the 2000 movie Under Suspicion, starring Gene Hackman and Morgan Freeman. This movie is about a police interview of a murder suspect. What was supposed to be a quick 10-minute conversation turned to an interrogation that went on all evening. This is an ongoing series we will have featuring some of the best legal movies. We'll examine the law demonstrated in the movie and what can lawyers or law students learn from this movie, as well as the entertainment aspect. In this movie, we're going to focus on the police interview or interrogation process and techniques. Welcome to the For Legal English podcast. This is the show for lawyers, law students, and other professionals from all over the world who want to improve both their legal English and legal knowledge. In this podcast, we discuss different legal topics, such as law in the news, law in practice, legal writing, legal movies, and other issues. I'm Timothy Barrett, your host. I'm a former practicing attorney from the United States, and now I teach law in legal English in Tbilisi, Georgia. Go to our website, 4 as in the number 4, Legal English, no spaces or dashes, .com. That's 4legalenglish.com. Check out our blog articles, available courses, and the show notes for this episode. On the docket today, Under Suspicion and Police Interviews. The film. Under Suspicion is a 2000 film directed by Stephen Hopkins. It's based on a book by John Wainwright called Brainwash. And this is also a remake of a French movie from 1981 called Garde à Vue. Under Suspicion has a star-filled cast led by Gene Hackman and Morgan Freeman. Gene Hackman plays Henry Hurst, who is the suspect in this case. Morgan Freeman plays Captain Victor Benezet. The junior detective is Detective Felix Owens, played by Thomas Jane, and Henry Hurst's wife, Chantal, is played by Monica Bellucci. And of course, there will be spoilers about the movie, so if you want to watch the movie first and then come back, that's fine. Just remember to come back. But I will discuss some spoilers about the movie. All right, here we go. So in brief, the movie is about a police interview with a wealthy tax attorney who had earlier discovered a murder victim. The whole movie takes place in one evening. It's not exactly in real time, but it's pretty close. Of course, it does have flashbacks as the witness tells their story, or the detectives describe what they think happened. But other than that, most of it takes place within the police station. It's very good cinematography, lots of close shots, and you can really see the emotions of the actors, especially as the evening goes on and they get more emotional. The stakes seem to get higher. And also running through this is that the suspect, Hackman, is supposed to give a speech at a charity event not far from the police station. So this also adds an air of urgency. Will the interview be over before the speech? Or will he be arrested before the speech? What's going to happen? And of course, he is an important citizen. This is not a normal suspect, and he's treated a little bit differently because of that, at least in the beginning. And the suspect, Gene Hackman, is an older man, and he has a much younger wife, played by Monica Bellucci. And it does have an air of whodunit. Was it the primary suspect, Gene Hackman, or are the detectives on the wrong path? So why are they suspicious? Well, his story does have holes, does have gaps in it. He then explains those gaps or remembers something that he didn't tell before, then he explains that. Each of these might be insignificant, but altogether they do add up to something that may lead someone to be suspicious. And he does have secrets. He is a man with many secrets, including about his marriage and his extramarital activities, things like that. This is definitely a case of circumstantial evidence. Sometimes we call this indirect evidence. There's not a lot of evidence that clearly says he did it, but there's lots of evidence that kind of puts him at the scene or is kind of suspicious. Like I said, all of that together kind of builds a case. But there is no direct evidence. There's no witness that says they saw this person kill this other person, that sort of thing. Many cases are built on circumstantial evidence. And most of the time, you don't have an eyewitness to a murder. So it's not too unusual to have a case built on circumstantial evidence. And that's one of the reasons why the interrogation or the interview is so important. They want the suspect to confess. Then it's clear. My thoughts. I think it's a very good movie, both for the police interviewing and interrogation process, but also the thriller aspects. I think nowadays many people, including myself, have a short attention span, or much shorter than it was earlier. I find it often difficult to pay attention to a whole movie. I may want to break it up and watch it another time, but that was not a problem with this movie. I wanted to keep watching it, see what happens. I watched it recently, but I hadn't seen it since the first time I watched it, and so didn't remember a lot of the details, and I certainly didn't remember the ending. It's very interesting to watch Freeman and Hackman go through the interrogation. Both are terrific actors, and when this was filmed, they're probably at the height of their career, or maybe towards the end of their career, but still at a very great height, and they both give a very great performance. So it's very entertaining to watch, and the ending is a good twist. Cinematography. When Henry, played by Hackman, or someone else is talking about what happened, you see the scene as it is described, which is kind of normal in movies or TV shows. But what's different is you also see the person they are talking to. For instance, Freeman as the detective asking the questions. They'll put him in the scene too. And so then Henry will be talking to the detective and maybe answering the questions as he acts out what happened in his version of what happened. So it's not a style that I've seen in a lot of other movies or TV shows, and it's pretty interesting to watch. And it also makes it clear that you're not actually seeing what happened, you're seeing what the witness is describing. And so maybe that is reality, maybe it's not. But you have to take it with a grain of salt. At some point towards the end of this description, they kind of suddenly go back to the interview room. Law in the movie. Most of the law in this movie is focused on just police procedure, the interview, the interrogation. But one thing I did want to bring out was this arrest for suspicion of murder. That's actually not a charge, at least not in the United States. And you can kind of see this where the superintendent, kind of like the police chief or the police commissioner, asks the captain, played by Freeman, do you have enough proof to arrest him? And Freeman responds basically, no. Which means, guess what? You can't arrest him. You can arrest someone for a crime, but not for a suspicion of a crime. And you often see this in movies, arrest for a suspicion of murder or some other crime. But this is not based in reality. Now, something that is based in reality is that it's not always clear, is the suspect in custody? So when they're questioning a suspect, is he free to go or she free to go? Often this is the case. They will walk in, they start talking to a detective, but at some point, they've gained enough probable cause that they can arrest the suspect. And it may become important. Are they under arrest? Are they being detained? Or are they free to leave? And this can cause problems, especially if Miranda rights were not informed, if they weren't waived. Whether they were detained or not, whether they were in custody, can change whether the confession or whatever admissions that were made are valid and can be used in court. Which brings us to Miranda rights or the Miranda warning. Miranda rights are basically the rights not to talk to the police. You don't have to answer questions, and you have the right to talk to an attorney. And usually if you can't afford one, then they will appoint one, a public defender. And you have the right to consult with that attorney before talking to the police or even during talking to the police and have that attorney present. This comes from a U.S. Supreme Court case, Miranda versus Arizona. And so commonly we call it Miranda. Now the Miranda warning is when the police, usually the detectives, will warn a suspect of these rights and ask them to waive the rights, to give up those rights. Basically informing the suspect they have the right not to speak to the detectives, but are they willing to speak anyway? And usually nowadays it's probably going to be in writing, especially in a formal detective interview, and it may be on video or audio recording. So it's very clear that the warnings were given. They had an opportunity maybe to ask questions if they didn't understand what the Miranda rights were, and that they freely gave up those rights, that they waived those rights. When is a Miranda warning required? Or when is it usually given? Miranda warning has to be given if the police are asking guilt-seeking questions and the suspect is in custody. So if you're not asking guilt-seeking questions, for instance, maybe you're asking their name, their address, are they allergic to something, or what kind of food do they want because they're in jail, those normally are not guilt-seeking questions. You don't have to Miranda the person. But if they're asking, where were you on the night of the crime, that's probably going to be considered a guilt-seeking question. It may not prove that they committed the crime, but it'll help build that case. It's certainly relevant to building that case if they can prove they were at the scene of the crime. So, and then what does in custody mean? Well, if they're not free to go, then they're in custody. Certainly, when a police officer says you're under arrest, they're in custody. Sometimes it doesn't have to be, strictly speaking, under arrest. There could be other factors. For instance, they're not free to go, or they believe they're not free to go. The door is locked. They're blocking them so they can't walk out the door. They try to leave and they're not allowed to leave. All of that would kind of lead a court to believe that they were, in fact, in custody. And when do detectives usually give this warning? In the movie, they kind of give it halfway through. When they've gained more evidence, they kind of treat it more as a police interrogation, so they give the Miranda warning. But most of the time, the police will do this at the very beginning. When someone comes in and starts talking to them, they want to give that Miranda warning because they can say, you're not a suspect, our goal is just to get some questions answered from you, etc., etc. And maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But if during that interview, during those questions and answers, they start suspecting this person, they don't have to suddenly stop the interview and now give Miranda warning. Because if they do, the suspect is probably going to be much more likely to say, I want my Miranda rights. Give me a lawyer. I'm not going to answer any more questions. So they want to get that out of the way in the beginning when maybe the suspect is less suspicious. Now, in the movie, Henry starts to leave at one point, and the detective uses force to stop him. This is the detective played by Thomas Jane, who I like as an actor, but I really didn't like I didn't like his character in this movie. Is it lawful to use force to stop a suspect to leave? Now, if he's under arrest, then certainly it is lawful to use force. But did the detective do this well? No. In fact, if I were the boss or supervisor, I would have a big problem with how he handled this. He should have been able to detain Hackman's character, who is a much older man, without hurting him, without ripping his suit, ripping off his toupee, or anything like that. There's no reason it had to escalate. And the fact that it did shows that the detective was not handling the situation properly. If you're enjoying today's episode, please share it with some of your friends and colleagues. If you can help spread the word about this podcast, that would be fantastic. It would help us find new listeners and improve our audience base. And don't forget to check out our website. It's 4 as in the number 4, Legal English, no spaces or dashes.com, 4legalenglish.com. You can check out our blog articles, available courses, and of course the show notes for this episode. If you are interested in criminal law, I wanted to introduce my new book, For Legal English, Criminal Law Lexicon. Explanations and exercises to understand criminal law terms. You can find this book on Amazon. The book is available as a paperback book or as an ebook. Please check it out on Amazon. If you do read it, of course, give me a great review on Amazon. It's brand new. And of course, you can go to the For Legal English website and find more information there. But it is being sold exclusively through Amazon. Interview, interrogation. So what is the difference between an interview or an interrogation? According to the very broad meaning, they could be synonyms. However, often we mean them with slight differences. The interview is usually softer. To interrogate or an interrogation is much more aggressive sounding. You're looking for specific answers, maybe a confession, but maybe something else. Interview is both a noun and a verb. Interrogation is the noun, interrogate is the verb. Interviewer, interrogator, that's the questioner, usually a detective. The interviewee or interrogatee is the suspect, the person being questioned. Now you can also think of interview and interrogate as kind of a spectrum. It may start out as an interview, kind of very friendly, just getting some background answers, trying to clear up some inconsistencies like it is in this movie. But then it slowly, and then maybe quickly, escalates to a full-blown interrogation. And you can see this in the movie. They start out in the captain's office. It's slightly informal, but at some point he starts an audio recording. And then at some point they start a video recording. They move from the captain's office to the interview room. So you can see it escalating and moving from the interview side of the spectrum into clearly the interrogation side of the spectrum. When we're talking about it, should we use the word interview or interrogate? Well, the police often use the word interview because they want it to sound a little softer. They don't want the suspect or a witness to be intimidated or get suspicious or be reluctant. Interview is much less threatening. In the room that they do this will often be called the interview room or interview room 3. If they refer to it as an interrogation room, it might sound a little scary to some people. This is to try to prevent people from raising their guard. Just like I said, they'll give the Miranda warning in the beginning, just in case later it's needed. Often the detective really thinks this is just a witness. They're just trying to get some information. But during that interview, they realize this is not just a witness. This is a suspect, or maybe this is the perpetrator. They don't want to have to stop the interview, give Miranda warnings, and then move into an interrogation room or that sort of thing. They want it to be a smooth transition. In the interview process, there is a lot of psychology and strategy behind it. And there are some detectives that are very, very good at this. Others not so much. But even just getting the suspect to talk, getting them to relax is very important. The more they're talking about other things, maybe they're talking about sports, they're talking about music, what they had for dinner, that sort of thing, complaining about something that they both dislike, it makes it easier for the suspect to keep talking. And then eventually, hopefully talk about something that's important, something that's relevant to the investigation. This reminds me of a case that I had and went to trial when I was a prosecutor, where we listened to the interview with the suspect. And I had the detective on the stand. And in the interview, the suspect is kind of talking bad about some of the local people. And the detective, of course, is agreeing. Oh, yeah, those are bad people, using expletives, that sort of thing. And it was very clear the jury was not liking the words that the detective was using, the sentiments that he was expressing, and the detective was very uncomfortable listening to his own words on the witness stand. But that was kind of what he had to do to get the suspect to relax and to talk about things that were relevant, that led to his being arrested and convicted. Another important thing to remember is that detectives can lie. They usually can't lie about like Miranda rights or things like that, but they can say there is evidence. For instance, maybe we have DNA evidence, we have blood evidence, we have fingerprints, something like that, even when there is no such evidence. Or say that there's a witness. A witness says you were there. A witness says they saw this, something like that. They don't necessarily have to tell the truth when interviewing a suspect. And their goal, of course, is to get admissions. Now, an admission is different than a confession. An admission is more narrower. A confession is more general. So to admit something, a suspect is admitting to certain details that are relevant. Maybe the suspect admits that they were at the scene of the crime, or that they did have a knife that was similar to the murder weapon, or that they hated the victim. They had some reason to hate the victim. Those details don't prove that they committed the crime, but they are relevant and they help build that case. When we say a suspect confesses, we're saying that they pretty much admit to everything. They confess that they committed the crime. But even if they do that, the detectives still want them to make certain admissions, get them to admit each of the details. One thing I sometimes get frustrated with watching police TV shows is they'll have an interview, and then all of a sudden the detective and the suspect will kind of realize something important was admitted, and then the suspect says, okay, I admit it. And then it's over. No, in a real investigation, the detective would have them walk through it, get them to admit all these details, so that later, if they wanted to say that they didn't really do it, it's much more difficult because they made all these admissions. Good cop, bad cop. So this is a common technique or strategy where when you have two people here, two detectives, one will play the good cop, the other will play the bad cop. That is to say, the good cop is trying to be friendly, they're trying to help the suspect, and the bad cop is being a little bit more aggressive. Now, this can be an effective strategy, not just for police interviews, but other things as well. And when you first watch the interview, it seems like maybe that's what they're trying for. But then you realize that, no, that's really not the strategy here. Just Thomas Jane's character, that junior detective, is just really a poor interviewer. He's very emotional, often for no reason. Now, it may be good to get the suspect to react, to keep them off guard. So the detective might pretend to be very emotional or very certain of themselves or very angry. But that's really not what's happening here. He's very emotional for no reason. At some point, the detective reveals that there was a rape. And this was not known, not discussed before this. So the detective gave information to the suspect that the suspect didn't already have. And for no reason. He didn't get anything out of it. The detective was very emotional. He also believes that they got him, but it's really far from reality. What evidence at that point did they have against him? Like we said, it was all circumstantial. Freeman's character was much better, but even he got emotional towards the end when Hackman intentionally baited him. Then he looked into the camera and realized he had kind of reacted. But it is often an advantage to have two detectives that work well together. I've seen this. I've seen video recordings of this as well as being in the other room watching it live. And when you get a couple of good detectives, they can do a great job together. The confession. After they show Hackman's character photos of the victim that were taken from his darkroom, he's an amateur photographer, he believes that his wife looked for them and turned them over to the detectives. And at that point, he kind of gives up, maybe on life. Even his wife believes that he did this or wants him to be convicted of it, regardless of whether he did it, then what does he really have to live for? He even says, wow, the lengths she went to. One of the questions is, why does he have these photographs if he is not the murderer, if he wasn't stalking these girls, these young girls? And I think that the answer is he was an amateur photographer. He took photos of lots of people all over the island, and he just happens to have these two victims in his photograph collection. I read one reviewer who commented that the characters in the film are deflated, confused, and unhappy with the ending, which brings us to the dangers of confessions. The dangers of false confessions. Are confessions reliable? Why would someone confess if they didn't do it? There are psychological reasons. Some people want to confess for something and be known for something, that sort of thing. Other people might want to protect somebody else. The interviewer ideally should have information that the suspect does not, something that only the police and the killer know. And they can use this information to kind of make sure that the suspect, even if he's confessing, is actually the killer, is actually the murderer, because only the murderer would know this. So after Henry confesses, they kind of walk him through this, but he just recaps all the things that they told him earlier that evening about the murder. He didn't really add anything new. For example, he said that he dressed them again and posed them, but this is what they've already described to him. They should have asked him something that only the murderer would know. For example, maybe what was under the clothes, what color underwear did they have, something like that. Even if he was at the murder scene, because he discovered one of the bodies and then called the police, but even though he was there, he would not know this detail. And often police will try to keep some information out of the public, out of the papers, so that they will know if they find the real killer. Of course, another aspect is, it's good if the police are interrogating a suspect, that the suspect doesn't exactly know what the police know. So maybe the police do have this evidence. Maybe they do have this witness. Final thoughts. The movie Law and Lawyers. So let's start with the law. This was a good police interview. The captain knew the suspect, which can be an advantage and a disadvantage. But watching the whole process and switch from a casual interview that was contentious, but to a clear interrogation, was very informative and entertaining to watch. The lawyers. Really, the only lawyer is Hackman's character, Henry Hurst. I understand why he started out alone, but at some point, I think he would call a criminal defense attorney and just shut up, stop talking. But of course, it reminds me of the expression, a lawyer can represent himself, but he will have a fool for a client. No matter how great a lawyer you are, you don't really want to represent yourself. You want someone a little bit more detached. And of course, Hackman's character might have been a great lawyer, but he wasn't a criminal lawyer. He was a tax lawyer. So what can we as lawyers learn from this movie? I think we can learn about police interviews, strategies involved, and of course, the dangers of confessions. As a film, how entertaining is this? I would say this is both entertaining and thrilling. I think this was a really good movie. I would highly recommend watching it. Lexicon terms. Here are some of the legal terms that I used in the episode. Admission, admit, circumstantial evidence, confess, confession, direct evidence, indirect evidence, interrogator, interrogate, interrogatee, interrogation, interview, interviewee, interviewer. Do you understand all these lexicon words? If you have any questions about these lexicon words, go to the show notes and comment at the very bottom. Do you have any questions or comments about today's episode? What did you think about this movie? Have you seen it? How did you like the ending? I tried not to go too much into spoiling the ending. If you haven't seen it, I do recommend watching the movie and let me know what you think of the ending and the movie in general. Check out our website, 4 as in the number 4, Legal English, no spaces or dashes.com, 4legalenglish.com. Check out our blog articles, available courses in the show notes for this episode. Comment. It's a great way to practice and improve your legal English skills. Just scroll down to the show notes and drop a comment. Please subscribe to the podcast, give us 5 stars and a review. It would really help us grow. Next time on the docket, we'll have our new word of the week. For Legal English podcast is adjourned. Don't miss the next docket call.